Good evening. I'm Lynn Fridley, Program Coordinator for Maddie's Institute. The topic of our webcast is the dollars and cents of sheltering, the tools for financially evaluating your shelter's programs. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Nicole Widmar, Assistant Professor for the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. In addition to her focus on agriculture, she has worked to adapt economic management concepts for use in shelters, ranging from managing flow-through to assessing how alternative practices impact overall shelter performance. The financial management tools that Dr. Widmar will present tonight will assist you with understanding enterprise budgeting, partial budgeting, balance sheets, income statements, and cash flow statements. But before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items that we need to cover. Please take a look at the left-hand side of your screen where you'll see a Q&A window. That's where you will ask questions during the event. Dr. Widmar will answer as many as she can at the end of the presentation. But please submit your questions early. Questions submitted in the last few minutes will not be processed in time for a response. If you need help with your connection during the presentation, you can click on the question mark, which is the help icon at the bottom of your screen. There are other little images along with the help button. These are called widgets. The green file widget will take you to the presentation handout, as well as information from Maddie's Institute. Before I turn things over to Dr. Widmar, I want to say a few words about Maddie's Fund. We are the nation's leading funder of shelter medicine education, and it is our goal to help save the lives of all of our nation's healthy and treatable shelter dogs and cats. The inspiration for that goal was a little dog named Maddie, who shared her unconditional love with Dave and Cheryl Duffield. They promised her that they would honor that love by founding Maddie's Fund and helping make this country a safe and loving place for all of her kind. Please use what you learn here tonight to make the dream she inspired a reality. Dr. Widmar, thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm very excited to share some shelter decision-making tools and some financial analysis tools that I think can be very helpful in working through different decisions that need to be made in the shelter, as well as looking at some whole business planning or whole shelter planning. So I'm very excited to be here. I've titled my talk, Informing Shelter Decision-Making Through Financial Scenario Analysis, and I do provide an example case of looking at different shelter adoption strategies. But I really do want to stress that the real kind of point of tonight is to go through a number of tools that you can use in your own shelter. So I'm going to provide some examples and some sort of baseline cases that I've worked through to show some examples of how powerful these tools can be, but really want people to focus on taking away what you can use in your own shelter at home, because every case is going to be a little bit different. And so what we're really trying to do is lay some groundwork and make sure that people have a grasp of all the different tools in the toolbox that you can employ to help your own shelter function better and ultimately save more lives. So with that, I will get started. And just to give you a little bit of background, a lot of what I'm pulling into the presentation tonight is really pulling from farm business management concepts. So concepts that have been long used in farm business management as well as other business management, and looking at really how you apply some of these animal-related business management and decision-making criteria to companion animals and pet animals in the shelter setting. And so in a lot of cases, we're borrowing tried and true concepts of, say, herd management, where we're looking at how do we assess different performance of different animals in the herd, and how do we make financial decisions going forward so that we can best help all the animals out there? How do we prioritize? How do we allocate our resources? So just to give a little bit of background, these are not necessarily new concepts or new tools, but it's a bit of an adaptation to apply that tool to the shelter setting. And so I think that really fits for our objective for tonight. The overall objective is to look at the key components of shelter economics. So what are some of the things that you should think about when you're making management decisions in your shelter? We're going to use a recently developed management tool to illustrate some different scenarios that have to do with different adoption strategies and look at the financial outcomes. But what we're going to do before we kind of get to that end piece and look at some of the outcomes is walk through how do you do this for your own shelter at home. So what are some of the steps that you should be going through to make sure that you're making the best decisions possible with the resources that you have? To get us started, we'll start with an introduction to shelter economics. So I divided shelter management, as we do most businesses, into two sort of broad categories. So we have strategic management and tactical management. Strategic management is the process of charting an overall long-term course for the firm. And so in the business world, we would say we're going to look at the overall course of where is this firm or this business headed. And it's the exact same thing in a shelter. So what's the overall long-term goal of the shelter? And we have to contrast that to tactical management. And that's the process of making and implementing your short-term decisions that keep the shelter moving forward to reach its eventual long-term goals. So you can really think of this tactical management is deciding who's going to go in what room, and it's deciding where you're going to purchase feed and supplies from, and how many volunteer hours it takes to make this thing run on a daily basis. These are all tactical decisions. They're relatively short-term, and it's what it takes to keep the shelter running. Strategic decisions are really thinking forward in terms of what is this shelter going to look like in 5 years? And how are we going to get it there? Okay, how are we going to get it there is a long-term question. Tactical management's those short-term decisions that keep you moving. And so it's really impossible to talk about shelter management and not include both pieces. I will say that oftentimes strategic management is the piece that gets overlooked. And that's true not just in shelters, but overall. Strategic management is sort of that thing that never comes up until you realize that you're maybe off the course that you had originally envisioned. And that's true across the board. Strategic management's really easy to overlook. And the problem is once you're missing it, seldom do we resort to strategic management. So we sort of lack a long-term plan because a lot of other things come up and get in the way. And many of us are really, really passionate about what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. And if we're being totally honest, not many of us are really, really passionate about long-term charting, long-term planning, or paperwork. And so what happens is we start looking at really the day-to-day issues, and we become really impassioned with how we're going to move this forward. And we really have to take a step back once in a while and think, if we're moving forward, do we know which direction it is that we want to go? And so that's where we'll get started with strategic management, to sort of take a step back and do a big picture look.
Oh, well, yeah, we have our first poll question, and I'll bet this has to do with strategic management. Do you have strategic management plan in place in your shelter? Please check off yes, no, don't know, or not applicable. So the audience, this is your opportunity to give us a little feedback on what you're doing in your shelter at this point. Please select your answer, and we'll wait just a second or two more to see if we can get everybody's answer in here. Do you have a strategic management plan in place for your shelter? Let's look at the results. So, Dr. Widmar, that's interesting. I can see that we have a lot of work to do today.
Yes. So we are showing, I'm seeing about 27% say yes, they have a strategic management plan in place. About 45% say no, 15% say don't know, and 12.5% say it doesn't apply. And so I don't know that it's any different really in the shelter world then compared into most other industries. Whether or not you have a strategic management plan in place, the wording on that is purposefully a little bit vague because to some people that means, did I ever write down a plan and put it on the shelf? And to some people, that's having a strategic management plan. But in reality, having a strategic management plan in place is when we sit down to make a decision and we really have to decide, do we do A or do we do B in this situation? Do we go back and say, who do we want to be in 5 years and does this help us get there? And so having a strategic management plan, it's really a living thing. And again, this is not something that most businesses in any industry tend to gravitate towards. It tends to be the thing that you really would just prefer to do tomorrow, no matter what day it is. But it becomes really important. And so if we think about strategic management, you can really think about it in terms of anticipating, driving, and capitalizing. So anticipating means being aware of things that are going on in the world outside you and being prepared for changes in those environments that could affect you in the future. So if we're thinking about anticipating a more macro environment, we're thinking about what's going on in terms of the general economy and how is that going to impact people's ability to care for their pets. Are we expecting that an economic downturn would end up having more people relinquish pets? What's that going to mean to a shelter? It's going to depend a lot on where you are specifically geographically. And so think about anticipating. We know that nobody can actually see the future. But relative to your own shelter and your own place, nobody knows that industry better than you do. So the question is, do you have an idea of what's going on out there, and have you done a little bit of brainstorming in terms of what could happen and what's likely to happen? That's anticipating. Then we can think about driving, and that's shaping the future. So shaping means you're going to take actions to respond to those anticipated events so that you can help change those events to be in your favor. So how are you going to position yourself so that if what you think is going to develop actually does develop, you're in the best possible situation to deal with it? So if you have something going on in your immediate community and you can see that this is going to be a problem, maybe there's a natural disaster and you're going to end up having a lot more animals than you counted on, can you think about how that's going to move forward? How can we plan for that so that when we actually get there, we can capitalize and we can make the best of what the future brings and move forward from there? So if I'm anticipating seeing more animals coming into my shelter for a specific reason, can I prepare myself and then capitalize on that and really work to save as many lives as I possibly can in the best possible way? And so thinking about strategic management, I think it's easiest to just look at it in those 3 steps. Can I anticipate what's going to happen or potentially going to happen? Can I work to shape that future? And then how can I capitalize on that and make the most of what's going on? For your individual firm, when we think about strategic planning or your individual shelter, we're asking you to answer 3 key questions. It's where are you now, where are you going, and how are you going to get there? And these are sort of those big all-encompassing questions. In terms of where are we now, it's really easy to say I'm in a shelter and I save lives. But we're really asking for something a little deeper than that. So where are we standing right now in terms of our financial performance? Where are we standing right now in terms of numbers? Have we looked at how we're actually performing out there? Where are we going? So who do I want to be in 5 years in terms of this operation? Do I want to be double my size? Or do I maybe not want to be any larger, but do I really want to move into a specific area, focusing on a specific problem, helping the community with a specific issue? And then finally, how are we going to get there? And so we define this in terms of what we call the performance gap. So if we look at outcomes, those are on the vertical axis. And typically, it would be thought of in terms of growth or profit generation. But it's really easy to replace outcome with the number of lives saved. So if you want to measure it in terms of lives, outcome is the number of lives saved. Time is across on the bottom on the horizontal axis. And we said that strategy and strategic planning starts by thinking about our current path. So do we have the numbers to look at the current performance of the shelter and think about where we are right now? Then we talk about where we want to be. So then we have a goal for who we want to be in the future. And the difference between the two is how we define the performance gap. And then it becomes really simple to think about strategic planning. Once you know what your current path is and who you want to be in the future or where you want to go, strategic planning asks you, how are you going to close the gap? So how are you going to get from who you are today to who you want to be in the future in terms of a shelter? If we're thinking about closing that gap, we need to think about our current position. So with respect to serving the needs of the community or the animals in need, and the general economic situation that's out there. We have to determine our goal. We said we're asking who we want to be in 5, 10, or it's up to you really, how many years. Then we have to think about our own shelter and our marketplace. What are the strengths and weaknesses of our shelter and its functioning? And what are the opportunities and threats that are offered to us out in our own communities? And then how do we start down the path that leads us to our goal? So we're looking at both short and long-term steps to move us towards our target. If we think about it in terms of a management process, we can start by assessing the situation. So what's the mission of the shelter? Most shelters have within their mission and vision and goals saving lives as at least part of that. But do we also have other considerations that we're working for? Are we doing specific things for our community? Are we performing outreach, education to the community members in terms of how to care for animals, how to care for a pet, how to improve the lives of animals that are not just in our shelters, but animals that are still in homes? Are there other things that we should be thinking about as part of our mission and our vision? And if so, we're going to have to think about how to pay for those things. And so you can see we're really setting up the framework in terms of we have to know who we are and what we value before we can start making decisions in terms of how to use our resources, including our financial resources, to move ourselves forward. So when we're assessing the situation, we're thinking about the objectives, we're thinking about our customers or people that we're serving, our own operation, what are our weaknesses, our strengths, our opportunities, the threats that are out there, and thinking about market conditions. If we move inward a little bit, we're thinking about implementation of our strategy. So we have talked a little bit about how we would formulate that strategy, but let's think about what our products are that we're actually offering to people. And product is not just a tangible product. It's products and services. So it's not just selling someone a product. It's bringing an experience to the community. And sheltering as an industry has a very unique product that it's offering in terms of offering a product not only to people that are touched directly, so potentially people whose animals have been helped or saved, or people who have obtained animals through the shelter system, but also there's a value to others in the community who you may never actually interact with. And so in economics, we talk about an existence value, which means that even though I may never actually interact with or directly benefit from a product or a good or a service, I really get value out of knowing that it's there. And so it has this interesting component to it that a lot of other businesses don't, because it is something that's valued in society. And so how do we think about including that in our implementation of strategy, in who we want to be and who we want to present ourselves as, so that when we start thinking about making decisions and using resources, we're taking into effect the complete picture. We also have to remember that part of our resources at hand and part of this implementation has to do with people. And so people could mean paid employees of the shelter. It can also mean volunteers, as well as community members who may be providing support in other ways. And finally, at the core of all of that is operations management. So we've looked at the outside situation, we've thought about implementation of our strategy, and we still have to do the everyday, day-to-day tasks to run the shelter. And so there's a big difference between what we just spent the last 15 minutes talking about in terms of charting long-term action. Notice we did not talk about the actual hands-on day-to-day operations in the shelter. So these are really two distinct areas. Strategic management's talking about long-term course. Where are we headed? Who do we want to be? How are we going to get there? As compared to operation of the shelter or the tactical management, making decisions that are hands-on and there with the animals. Again, strategic management tends to be the one that's overlooked, so that's why we spent some time there. It does become very important, and it often makes a very big difference between those who are financially viable and those who are not. Because oftentimes we skip planning because we get busy. And that's true in every industry. It's not just in shelters. We get busy, we skip planning. And I do kind of always think about it in terms of when we skip planning, we oftentimes run into trouble down the line. But when we run into trouble, we never resort to planning. Once we actually have a problem down the line, we start putting out fires. And it takes a lot of energy and management capacity, and it really diverts our attention away from what was the core goal. So if we're always trying to, for example, fill missing positions, so if we have a lot of turnover with volunteers and we have not planned ahead in terms of how we're going to train and bring new volunteers in, we spend all of our time sort of fighting fires and feeling like we're always trying to catch up. And it really eventually takes management capacity out of the long-term goal. And so strategic management is often overlooked but very important. So that's our first item to think about. Then if we move into a few different concepts that we want to work on, some key points I want to touch in terms of shelter economics are thinking about fixed versus variable costs. And I realize we're jumping a little bit all over the place here tonight, but on this time frame, I do want to make sure that we get a number of tools out there in front of everybody so that at the very least we know what we're looking for in terms of additional information, but really want to sort of provide a whole picture in terms of things that you can use to move forward. So coming back to fixed versus variable costs or expenses, and then also looking at revenue or income streams and thinking about revenue streams that are directly related to animal lives saved and those that are not directly related. Because when we look at the financial performance of the shelter, and in some of the examples that I'll work through at the end, there's a very big difference in where your revenue is coming from relative to animals saved. If it's adoption revenues, for example, that's going to be directly related to the number of animals saved. If it's, say, donations that are not tied to adoptions, that's not directly related to the number of animals saved. And this is going to make a pretty big difference in terms of planning for spending and our financial planning for the shelter moving forward. So just to set the stage, that's something that we're thinking about for the rest of the presentation. There are always two ways to improve a bottom line. And I am using the word profit. And I realize that most shelters are organized as a not-for-profit organization. But I think that the concept holds true regardless. We're looking at profit being defined as revenue or the income minus cost, which is the total expenses. Not-for-profit businesses in particular tend to focus on cost. They tend to be focused on being a low-cost operation. And I think a lot of times we actually lose the realization that there's two ways to improve a bottom line. The two ways that you have are you can work to increase your revenue or to decrease your cost. And the problem with focusing only on cost is that if we become too focused on only being low cost, it can really hurt our ability to generate additional income. And so when I say profit for the shelter, profit shouldn't be thought of as a negative. There should be no negative connotation with profit, because the real question is, what can the shelter do with profit? If you have higher revenue or higher income than what your expenses are, you can turn that profit into additional lives saved. And so what we're really looking at is the bottom line of how am I going to fulfill a mission of saving lives? If I want to fulfill a mission of saving lives, I can use additional profit generated in my business or in my shelter to do so. And so we are going to look at two different ways to improve that. I can generate more income, or I can reduce cost, or ideally I could do both simultaneously. So something to think about as we move forward.
Well, we have our next poll question. Do you actively think about how to improve profitability in your shelter? And the answers would be yes, no, or not applicable. So, do you actively think about how to improve your profitability? And while we're waiting for the results to get in here, I want to encourage everybody to ask questions in the Q&A box on the left-hand side of your screen. And at the end of the presentation, Dr. Widmar will be happy to address those. So let's see our results. Well, there's some good answers, Dr. Widmar.
Yes, that is a good answer. So do you actively think about improving profitability? 80% are saying yes. And so I think that is very exciting because there is a sort of tendency in the not-for-profit organizations to sort of look upon profit as a negative. And I really think a lot of good can come from looking at it as a positive thing and at reinvesting it back into the shelter and its mission. So that's great. Back to our costs and expenses. If we think about fixed costs or expenses, we're looking at ownership or fixed or indirect costs. So those are costs that arise from actually existing. And so those are costs that arise from owning buildings or land or other long-term assets that the shelter might be invested in. And so if your shelter is tied to a dog park or any other facility, the fixed costs are the costs that exist just to have that there. So they arise from owning assets, and they would exist even if you didn't use those assets. So you can think about things like taxes. Even if you had no animals in the building, you would still owe taxes or payment on the building or upkeep on the building, even though you weren't using it. Perhaps the problem usually arises in terms of fixed costs because they're really difficult to assign to an enterprise. And so when you're thinking about managing fixed costs, it tends to be we want to minimize, but we really don't know where to allocate that cost. So it's often appropriate and necessary. They're kind of overhead. They run over top of everything else. We tend to spread them across all of our enterprises. But sometimes they are charged to enterprises based on that enterprise's share of the total cost or the total revenue. Perhaps more important to this problem, or to this question, is thinking about variable costs. So these are operating or variable costs, and they arise from the actual operation of the enterprise. So these do not exist if you don't operate. So you can think about things like food and medicine and veterinary expenses. If there are no animals in the building, then those expenses would drop back to zero. Whereas when we're looking at fixed costs, those expenses would exist anyway. On the revenue side, the part that we often don't sort of disaggregate, and shelters are a little bit unique in this way, is that some of our revenue streams are directly tied to lives saved and some are not. So adoption fees, we said earlier, are tied to the number of lives that are saved. Donations are not directly tied. Sale of goods, so if you have any other income in the shelter from sale of products perhaps, then those are not directly tied. And potentially fundraising events are not directly tied. Now, I think that it's worth mentioning on this particular slide and in relative to this, a lot of people will automatically say, well, donations might not be tied to the number of lives saved directly, but certainly people want to donate into a shelter that they feel saves lives or makes a difference. And that's absolutely true. But setting up for making financial decisions and thinking about where our resources are getting spent, it's becoming really important, and at least in our sort of research work moving forward and how we're making shelter decisions and sort of trying to analyze what the impact is on the bottom line, when you move something that's tied to lives saved like adoption fees, it's very different compared to donations, the sale of goods, or other fundraising. And we'll get into a little bit why. So we went through variable costs, fixed costs, and various sources of revenue. So the question is, how am I going to use all of that, right? These are all nice concepts, but actually how do I use it and make it useful in my own shelter starting tomorrow? And the answer is through enterprise budgeting. And so an enterprise budget is an organization of those revenues, expenses, and finally profit or net income for a single enterprise. And typically each business unit or type of animal is an enterprise. And the base unit for an enterprise budget is generally a single unit of production. So if we're thinking about a base unit for a shelter, we would be thinking about developing a per dog budget, or per cat, or per kitten, or per puppy. And so we're actually thinking about a per animal budget moving forward. And you can already see where we're headed with this because we talked about direct cost versus variable cost versus income. And so if you think about lining up a budget, say, per dog, if I have the dog and I'm looking at the income, which would potentially be adoption fees, expenses is going to be not only the overhead to run the building and to have staff on hand or whoever's caring for the animal, but also we're looking at food and veterinary expenses, bedding, all the other expenses that would go with that animal. So how do we organize those in a way that makes sense that can help us? Some shelters have said, as we've brought this concept forward, does it really make sense to do a budget for every single dog? And certainly it's understandable to say in some situations it might not. In some places it has made sense to have a unit, for example, a room in your shelter. So are you talking about a budget for this room of kittens? Or is it a group of 30 kittens who came in together? So are you managing expenses on a group of animals? And absolutely that might make sense for your shelter in certain situations. So it's not a hard and fast rule that it has to be a budget for every single animal, because none of us have the time to sit down and sort of budget this out for every animal that comes through the door. But we do want to have on hand a sort of basic idea of what it costs per dog, per cat, per puppy, per kitten. With that in mind, you may need to have multiple budgets per enterprise sitting on hand. So you might have a budget on hand for fast-track kittens, for example, and a separate budget for other kittens. Or it may be a time of year factor. Or we might be looking at having a budget on hand and saying the average 30-pound dog generates this much and costs this much in the shelter, but the average 100-pound dog might look very different, or I would expect to look very different. So the interesting thing on the enterprise budgets is that if we use common units, and for example we have maybe 15 different kitten budgets, we can look at a per kitten basis and say for kittens that came in and potentially had this health problem or this health challenge, at the end of the day the expenses are on average X amount and the income is on average Y. And what we're finding as we're looking across shelters is that oftentimes the baseline case is that those adoption fees are not covering the expenses. And so a lot of people have said, well, if we already know this, why are we worried about the enterprise budget? It is extremely useful to know on a per animal basis how much it's costing you to save that life. And we're not looking at it as a negative. We're looking at it as a positive, because right there you have your answer for how much you have to obtain in revenue in other ways in order to save that, not only save that life, but to have the shelter be even better off financially to save the next life. And so what you can do is start to determine that gap. How much do I have to generate in terms of donations or in sales or fundraising to ensure that not only this kitten, puppy, dog, or cat was able to move through the shelter and was cared for in a way that benefited it and move forward, but also I'll be able to help the next one and more of them. So the enterprise budget, while it may sound very simple and also a bit time-consuming, and it is, setting them up for the first time does take a little bit of thought and extra data from your shelter. It's a really powerful tool that most businesses find very valuable in terms of once you've created them, you can use them to make a lot of decisions in your shelter. You can use your enterprise budget to determine what's the most profitable enterprise. Where can you generate the most? So can you identify those fast-track animals that potentially do cover their costs and help cover someone else's? Can you identify them quickly and easily so that you can have a whole shelter plan to move forward to capitalize on those animals when you can in terms of having them not only pay their share but help you save another life? And can you identify early on those animals who are likely to cost more than they're able to generate back and have a plan on hand for how to cover that difference? Enterprise budgets do require a lot of data, but once they're completed, those enterprise budgets themselves are a good source of data for other budgeting exercises, for decision making for your shelter, and also in terms of how you present your shelter to others on the outside in terms of soliciting more donations. So if we know exactly how much it costs us to save a life, and we can move forward and say that not only did we save this life, but we've actually positioned ourselves to save additional lives in the future because we did it in a financially sustainable manner, that's also exceptionally good PR for your shelter when you're talking to others out there in terms of how to keep the industry moving forward. In addition to thinking about cash costs, everything we've talked about so far, you'd have to pay from the checkbook or pay for in cash. So we're talking about money. We also have to think about unpaid factors. And the biggest unpaid factor for this industry, whoops, I think I might have gone backwards there. Sorry about that. The biggest unpaid factor we have in this industry is when we're looking at volunteer hours. So volunteer hours are not free. And in terms of thinking about the actual cost of saving a life and the cost of helping an animal through your shelter, we really do need to account for the cost of those hours. And so if we're thinking about opportunity cost, that's a good way to account for these unpaid factors. So opportunity cost is the cost of using a resource that could have been used somewhere else. And it's a very common concept in decision making. And so we're thinking about trade-offs. It's the earnings that that resource could have gotten you in its next best alternative. And it's also, it's that it costs you what you could have sold that resource for. And so if you're thinking about it, the opportunity cost of your time is what else you could have done with that time. So if you have a volunteer coming in to help for an hour, say in your shelter, their opportunity cost of being there is what else they could have done with that hour. Does that necessarily mean that you need to pay for that hour? No, it's an unpaid factor, and we acknowledge that. But something to think about in terms of decision making is when you're going to allocate that volunteer's time to doing one task, you have an opportunity cost in the shelter as well, because you could have allocated that hour to doing a different task. And so we really start to think hard about the trade-offs of how we're allocating our resources, even when they don't cost us cash or cost us money. And so there is a common sort of conception that if it's not costing you outright money, we don't write a check for it, that it was free. And so opportunity cost really starts to acknowledge the fact that there is no free resource in your shelter. Using someone's time to do one task takes away from a different task. Assigning a shelter resource to one animal means that that resource may not be available for another animal. And so it really helps sort of think really hard in terms of trade-offs and what it costs you to use something even if we didn't have to pay cash for it. Technically, if you looked at opportunity cost, it's usually defined in one of two ways. It's the income that could have been generated by selling or renting an input to someone else. Or it's the additional income that you could have received if the input would have been used in its most profitable alternative use. And so actually we can think about, instead of additional income, think about additional lives saved. So it's the additional lives saved that we could have had if we would have used this input to do the next use instead of the use that we used it for. Thinking about trade-offs.
And we have one more poll question. We do have questions coming in the Q&A box, and keep them coming. We'll answer those at the end. And the poll question is, do you consider opportunity cost in your shelter decision making? The answer would be yes, no, don't know, or not applicable. So do you consider opportunity cost in your shelter decision making? And we'll give you just a few more seconds to answer the poll. And we'll go to the results. And that's some interesting answers there too, Dr. Widmar.
Yes, we have a pretty interesting split. So do you consider opportunity costs? We have just shy of 40% saying no. And I don't think it's very surprising because it is something that it escapes all of us in the moment. The more impassioned you are about what you're doing, the more focused you are on moving this particular task forward, it does become very difficult to account for the cost of these things that actually, if we're thinking about money or from the checkbook, didn't have a dollar value to them. And so really something to consider. I will show you in terms of how we think about the bottom line of the enterprise budget. If we think about receipts, that's your income. Those variable costs and fixed costs, we take those out and we end up with accounting profit or net income. This is typically what people think of when they think of profit, right? You had income, you paid all your bills, you paid for all of your expenses, both variable and fixed, and you have something left over that we call profit. If we're thinking about true economic profit, we also then have to take off the opportunity cost of those items that we didn't pay for. So for example, we would take our accounting profit that we just calculated and we would take off the value of all of that volunteer time that might be in your shelter, or of all the donations that came into your shelter in terms of food or bedding or other items that were used in your shelter. And what you're left with would be the economic profit. And that would be accounting for the true value of all the resources that went into your shelter. And so this is just something to think about when we're doing our own assessments of our own shelters at home and thinking about what did it really cost us per life saved? What did it really cost us per dog that came through the door to assign a value to those items that we didn't pay for in cash? And it's really a good way to be able to measure our progress over time. How many resources went into this animal, and how can I think about being more efficient in the future? We really want to make sure that when we're dependent upon those donations or that volunteer time, that we know how much of it's going into our current operation. It's not a matter of feeling like we have to pay it back or we're somehow indebted to these items that came in. It's simply a matter of making management decisions and being fully aware of all the resources it takes to move the shelter forward. And the real reason we want to do that is because we need to know how much volunteer labor or how much donation in terms of food or other items that are coming in it takes to run the shelter so that we can have contingency plans in place for if those didn't come through. So if we're thinking about how many hours it really takes to care for all this room of, let's say it's a room of dogs, we really need to know how much it takes to care for them so that we would know to have plans going forward and how to care for them if our situation were to change. So when we think about what really drove sort of my concept and how I wanted to cover these things, when we think about increasing the number of lives saved, you inevitably drive up your total variable cost. And this is something that becomes very difficult because you end up with a question where you're sort of stuck on this wheel. If you want to drive up the total number of lives saved, I'm going to drive up the total variable cost. And then the question that you should be asking yourself is, does your adoption fee per life saved cover that total variable cost? And we already said that for a lot of people, for the majority of the time, the answer is no. And so what happens if I take the number of lives saved, if I say every animal that comes through your shelter at the end of the day, on average, does not pay for itself? If I drive up that number, I drive up the total cost and I drive up the revenue, but I didn't drive up the revenue far enough. Therefore, we really have to think about what our variable costs are relative to that revenue generated, because I could end up saving a lot more lives and being in a much worse financial situation at the end of it. And so we really want to think about not just lives that are saved today, but how do we make sure that the shelter is a viable economic unit so that we can have more lives saved tomorrow. So does a puppy on average generate more or less in income than it costs to save in your shelter setting? Really something to think about, and we all have to know the answer for not every single individual puppy, but we really need to know the answer in terms of puppies that generally come in looking like this. What is the cold hard number in terms of how much we need to get in donations in addition to that adoption fee to pay for that puppy to move through the shelter? So if we take that concept, we're going to go pretty quickly through the financial statements because I really want to make sure we get to decision making and how we employ some of these things. But I wanted to make sure that we got through at least what are the basic financial statements that we're drawing from to make some of these decisions. And so we'll look at some financial management and financial statements. I think we've pretty well covered the concept that the reason to cover financial management is because we really need it to ensure that the operation can continue. So how are we going to make sure the shelter is here to perform its mission and to move forward for tomorrow? We have to have sustainable economic entities to be able to do that. If we think about the basics of business management, we really focus on 3 key statements. We think about the balance sheet, the income statement, and the cash flow statement. And we're going to go over them pretty quickly, but we want to focus on the concepts and what we can really gain from each of them. So your balance sheet is your financial report that summarizes the assets, the liabilities, which are the debts, and then the resulting equity or the net worth of the entity at any given point in time. And so a balance sheet is a snapshot concept. It's really only good for the day that you do it. And so it really only answers 2 key questions. So it's pretty simple. It says, what do you own and what do you owe? And so we have to think about making these for our shelter on an ongoing basis. So you may want to do them twice a year. It may be that you put one together monthly. And it really says, what are all the assets that we have out there? What do we own? Do we own our building? Do we own some supplies and materials? Do we have things in inventory that have a value to them? What do we owe? So do we have debts for these various items? Are we carrying a mortgage? What are the various liabilities that we have out there? So at the end of the day, what's the total value of what we own minus the total value of what we owe? And that's our net worth. And so what we are looking for over time is that our net worth were to increase so that we actually are worth more than what we owe outside the business. But it's also not just to watch it increase, but to also have a way to track over time and keep track of what the business looks like in terms of our assets and liabilities. So balance sheets really give us that snapshot statement of who we are or what we own and what we owe as far as who we are right today as a shelter. Income statements are probably the one that most people are familiar with, and that summarizes your income or your revenue and your expenses and computes the resulting profit of the business over a period of time. So the major purpose is to measure the difference between revenue and expenses, or to measure your profit. And so that one's probably pretty simple in terms of this is what we've been focusing on the whole time. If we've thought about how to manage profitability, which most of you did, in terms of our shelter, we're thinking about managing both income and expenses. The income statement's a little bit different than the cash flow statement, although sometimes the 2 get confused. So the cash flow statement records the timing and the size of cash inflows and outflows that occur over a given accounting period. And really the cash flow statement does just that. It focuses on cash. So will you have the cash on hand when you need it? It can answer when will you need to borrow money. So will there be a time where you know you're expecting income coming forward? Maybe you're a month away from your usual major donation time period of the year. Or do you need to borrow to get you through that time period? And how much will you need to borrow? When can you afford to increase your spending? And when should you repay outstanding debts? So your cash flow statement, in a lot of cases, ends up looking a little bit like your checkbook in terms of what do we actually have for cash on hand. But it asks it going forward. So can I think about when I will have excess cash on hand, and what should I do with it? So if I'm going to have excess cash on hand, can I think about ways to actually reduce my costs of saving lives? Do I think about when to pre-purchase, when to go out and look for volume discounts? When I have extra cash on hand, what can I do with that? So it's really working for my shelter and working for the mission that I set forward. So let's just not hold cash on hand. Let's really plan ahead and say, when I'm going to have cash, what am I going to do with it so it does the best possible thing for my shelter? And again, going back to all the way back to the beginning, a key here is that really takes planning. We really have to think in advance and know when we have it, what can we use it for so it has the best impact, and how can we really plan so that we know when we need it coming back around that we're going to have it back on hand again. So again, we're doing the same thing we talked about doing from the very beginning. 2 ways to improve our total profit, thinking about are we going to increase our revenue or are we going to decrease our cost. Now, I included a section here on risk because we know it's just not that simple. So the best laid plans, we know, become very difficult, and things almost never go as planned. And so we really need to make these plans and think about these budgets and include risk. And so have we thought about different scenarios? Have we thought about different potential outcomes and how to account for those? Different risks we need to think about in terms of our shelter. We can think about financial risk, Regulatory risk, so is there a potential that I change a regulation and that really shifts the cost of doing business in your shelter? Human resource risk is a big one. Whether it's hired, it's volunteer, or it's the management of your shelter, have we thought about what it would mean to lose human resources or to have to retrain different human resources in the shelter? Do we have a contingency plan on hand? Legal risk and also production. Production risk is typically categorized as production. In the shelter, that would be all the risks that go into housing a number of animals. So we have the potential for disease. We have the potential for increased cost should we have an outbreak in our shelter. So if we really think about that, have we accounted for that? Have we included in our cash planning for the next year, how are we going to pay for this if we have something happen so that it doesn't derail all of our efforts moving forward? When we think about risk from an economic standpoint, we tend to look at two different categories. So we can think about demand side or supply side. Demand side is all the things that affect the people who are walking into your shelter. So you can think about the general economy. If we have impact in the general economy, do we change the demand for pets? Do we change people's ability to pay for pet care for both their existing pets and potentially for pets that they would adopt? Do we change donations? Do we change people's propensity to donate into shelters and into saving lives? Location matters. So we have location, location, location. Different geographies are going to have different abilities to pay for shelter services and different abilities to support that shelter. Adoption fees, people's ability to pay them will change. Also, if you move adoption fees, we expect the demand for pets to change accordingly. So oftentimes we talk about things like we're going to have free kittens or no adoption fee. And the reason that we do that is because when we drop adoption fees or when we drop price in economics, we expect the quantity demanded to go up. So a drop in price should increase the number of adoptions. So then my question is, from the shelter side, a drop in price will increase the number of adoptions, but remember what we said. Every adoption or every animal that goes through the shelter actually leaves a bill behind. And so if I take your adoption fees down to zero, that's a much bigger bill that I've left behind. And that's not necessarily bad. That might mean more lives saved, but the question becomes, how are we going to pay for it? And do we have a plan in place ahead of time to cover those bills so that it's sustainable? Seasonality will affect demand. Total awareness in terms of what the shelter can provide in terms of those services. So do we have awareness in your community in terms of what you contribute, what you give to the community, what you give to these animals? That's going to affect demand, not only demand for pets as they come in, but it's also going to affect donations and people's willingness to give. And then thinking about segmentation of market. So something we talk about a lot in marketing and business, segmentation of the market says, are all of your potential customers the same? And I think most of us would agree the answer is no. And so not everyone who walks through the shelter door is exactly the same. And how do we tailor our approach to these different customers? So some customers would be willing to pay much more, some customers willing to pay much less. Have we thought about this from our individual shelter's perspective in terms of, can we segment that market? Do we have the ability to sort of adjust and cater to these different customers? And if yes, how are we going to move forward doing so in a sustainable way? And if no, just something to think about in terms of how we're serving the marketplace and how we can best move the shelter forward. If we flip to the supply side, again, general economy is going to affect the ability of the shelter to do what it does. Location, costs, so thinking about things like vaccines, food, veterinary care, all of the animal-related costs, as well as capital availability, resource availability for the shelter, and interest rates. So what's it costing the shelter in terms of ability to borrow money and cost to borrow money, and again, seasonality. So all of these factors are moving constantly, and it really adds complication. Making these budgets is not a one-time, we make the budget and put it on the shelf. The fact that all of these factors are moving and are affecting the bottom line of not only our business, but are changing the outer economy surrounding us means that they really need to be living documents. We really need to think about how to adjust our budgets moving forward so that they're always viable and current. because when we're faced with an important decision in the shelter that could really make a difference, we need to make sure we have all the information on hand and ready right then, because then we can make the best decision possible moving forward. It does always seem that when we really need this information, you just don't have the time to go out and collect it. These things need to be in place so that they can support your decision making moving forward. I think this is the second time we've said it, but don't get stuck on only thinking about decreasing costs. So we can think about decreasing costs. Is it how we procure food and supplies? Is it facilities and maintenance, different supplies and standard operating procedures in terms of how to keep our costs down? That's definitely important, but it's not the only way. Can we also think about increasing revenue and recognize that sometimes we have to spend money to make money? So additional fundraising and pursuing donations is likely to have a price tag. We're likely going to have to invest in that and put some of our shelter resources there. And remember, we said every dollar that we spend on fundraising or pursuing donations and every hour of someone's time that goes into that is an hour that did not go into something else. So we're taking time away from something else in the shelter, putting it behind fundraising. So it has a cost. But the question is, can we work to increase our revenue? And how effective at it are we? Thinking about grants, external funding, all of these things, again, are going to take management focus and time, but there really are two sides to the equation. Can we increase our revenue in addition to decreasing our cost? This all comes together to really say we have to know where we stand right now and have these decision-making processes in place so that when we have opportunities, remember going all the way back to strategic management, are we ready to capitalize on those moving forward so we can make the best possible difference with what we have? Sort of wrapping all these concepts together, we talked about enterprise budgeting, we talked about decision making. Enterprise budget, we already said, is this organization. It's got revenue, expenses, and profit. It's a planning tool. An enterprise budget allows you to test out some new ideas and compare enterprises to determine the best one. And so this planning tool really lets you sort of play on paper and figure out what would happen if I did this. And so we would commonly say this is your way to fail fast and fail cheap. We don't want to go and sort of pursue our plans and try a brand new strategy in the shelter and find out that it doesn't work. We spent money, we spent time, and we diverted attention from something that could have been better. And so if we think about this, this is really a model for your shelter. So you can test out your new ideas and say, well, what if I did spend more on this? What would my bottom line look like? The enterprise budget lets you test it out, say, on a per cat or a per dog basis, and you can compare across enterprises. So if you had an enterprise budget prepared for a cat that comes into your shelter, and you had the opportunity to, say, switch vendors and perhaps procure food from a different vendor, you could run those numbers through your enterprise budgets and say, at the end of the day, that's going to improve my bottom line for every dog that comes through by X dollar amount. Or at the end of the day, it's actually going to cost me more if I would make this switch. It makes it very easy for you to test out new ideas, whether that's changing of expenses, changing of the adoption fees, or your income, or both simultaneously. It also allows you to feed into break-even analysis very easily. So we said if you know how much every dog costs and every dog brings in, you know what the gap is and that difference. And so you really have a number that you can aim for to know if I achieve X number of donations in dollar donations per dog, then every dog who comes through may have covered his cost, for example. Partial budgets are really the last tool that we're going to dive into before we look at some examples. And partial budgets are a little bit different because partial budgets are very simple but powerful. It's the process of examining costs, income, and resources that change when you propose an adjustment in your shelter. So we're looking at profitability of alternatives under consideration. And we only look at the changes in revenue and cost. It isolates that effect of that change. And so if you look at the big picture, enterprise budgets looked at everything. I wanted every cost and every revenue for every dog and every kitten, every cat, and every puppy. A partial budget says, let's think about just the change. What if I just changed this one factor? How would things change in my shelter? This is really powerful for decision making, especially if you have all of your information already prepared in your enterprise budgets. Partial budgets are that tool you're going to reach for time and time again when you need to make a decision. Because if you have all of the data from your enterprise budget, partial budgets are a simple, they can be very fast, but very powerful way to assess some options in your shelter and decide which is best. Partial budget development, we're going to walk through it in a few steps. First, you identify your goals and option to be investigated. And so I know we're circling back again to our strategic management question. What's the actual goal? What are we trying to do by assessing this change? Then we're going to look at our revenues and expenses that need to be considered. And we're going to estimate the revenue and expense changes that are associated. Then we look at the changes with a positive or a negative impact on the business. Perform sensitivity, and that's how we account for that risk again. So, for example, if we're looking at changing, say, adoption fees, that's a good example. If we're looking at changing adoption fees and we say we want to change fees from $100 to $125, how is that going to change our bottom line? That's going to be a revenue increase. But then the question comes, if we raise our adoption fees, will we actually have less adoptions? Well, potentially, but we don't know how much. So we're going to perform sensitivity analysis to that. What if we reduced our adoptions by 5% because we raised those costs? Now what does the bottom line for the shelter look like? Okay, what if we were going to look at a 10% reduction? How is that different? So an example of those sensitivity analyses and how we'd look at that. And then finally, we'd review that in the outcome of the whole shelter. So if we're going to evaluate management changes, we're looking at the additions to our bottom line. So that's increase of revenue or decrease of expense, or both. Remember, we said there's two ways. And then we have our subtractions. So what are our decreases in income or our increases in expense? And we end up with a net change to the enterprise. And so the real beauty to partial budgets is that they're simple, they avoid the errors of the more complex models, and you're looking at only comparing two options. Here is just presented the general framework that could be used. So it's really easy to break it into 4 categories and say, if I make this change, how do I A, increase my revenue? So how do I make more money? How do I B, decrease my costs? How do I C, decrease my revenue? There's potential that I'm making a change that will actually make me less money, but that might be okay if I can decrease my expenses further. And finally, how do I increase expenses by making this change? And then I look at my net effect. If my net effect is positive, this would be a positive change. If it's negative, it would be a costly change. So a very powerful tool. Finally, I will move into some scenario analysis and some examples of how I've pulled these tools all together to sort of look at some all-inclusive questions in terms of shelters. And so I'm going to present a few results from an ongoing project that we're still finishing up just the final details on. But we looked at different adoption strategies used in animal shelters. And we said that can have a very large impact on the total number of adoptions and the donations that would take place. So if we think about things like reducing adoption fees during a kitten or puppy season as a way to reduce inventories and increase the number of lives saved, how does that impact the financial well-being of the shelter? In particular, if the per animal costs exceed the revenue, which would be the baseline case. And so the methods that were used here is I developed an enterprise budget for a cat, a kitten, a dog, and a puppy. And we'll simplify it a little bit and say we had general adoption fees going in. We had $150 for a dog, $175 for a puppy, $50 for a cat, $95 for a kitten as just a baseline example. And this is an example of the cost section of one of the enterprise budgets. So this is dog and puppy, and it's just to give a basic example of how did we go through and calculate the costs for this dog for every day that he was in the shelter, he or she, and then went through the various costs that would go into the animal, including the cost of food, the cost of different supplies, and also a daily boarding cost because there is going to be a cost in terms of the building. So this is a very sort of high-level overview of all the detail that went in terms of what are the costs and revenue associated with these animals. Some preliminary findings that I wanted to share with you. If we work our way, if we look first at the dogs, and we look at the total cost per dog, you can see that that's by far the highest bar on that graph there. And so if we read from left to right, we have our total cost for a dog in that high bar. Then we have the adoption revenue per animal. So the total revenue for the dog is that next bar. And then we have the revenue if we were to increase our adoption fees. And so clearly we have the highest cost, we have our baseline fees next, and then we have a slightly increased fee. And we said, okay, if we increased our fees, would that do it? And the answer clearly for the dog is still no. And so even when we raised fees, it was not enough to cover the cost of having the animal there. Now the question was, is that different across different enterprises? So if you look at cat, the story is very similar. Neither the regular fees nor the raised fees to the right there were enough to cover the total cost of having the cat. Puppies and kittens were perhaps a little bit different. The total puppy fee that was set in this example, and I should say this example was actually representative of no particular real shelter, but was just built as an example of how we could use some of these tools to inform some of these decisions. The puppy fees actually did cover the cost of having the average puppy in the shelter, but the kittens did not. And so in this baseline example where we just tried to use some industry averages, the only animal who was covering its own costs as it came through the shelter on average was a puppy. And so this goes back to our original conversation in terms of if we don't generate enough revenue per animal, how are we going to do it? It's going to have to be through donations or some sort of fundraising event because the adoption fees simply are not covering cost. If we use this as a jumping off point, you really have a question to ask yourself. I could raise the adoption fees high enough to cover their cost, but then what happens to the total number of lives saved? Do I actually save fewer animals because now I'm charging more per animal? And so we did look through a series of cases. And so if you go from left to right, the one that's labeled BC is our base case scenario. So that has the cost that I showed you up front, as well as those adoption fees that we looked at up front. I'm going to walk from left to right. So BC is our base case scenario. And what you can see is that the bar to the far left is your mean monthly net income. And remember we said net income was profit. And you can see that mean monthly net income in the base case scenario is indeed negative. And so at the end of the day, for the baseline case that we looked at in terms of just putting in some very general averages, what we actually had at the end of the day was more expenses than we had revenue or income. So you can see the adoption revenue is that white bar with the black dots. And so we have adoption revenue, but right next to that we have animal cost. And so you can see that our animal costs are far exceeding our adoption revenue. And so that is why we end up with a negative profit. So this led us to ask, well, what if we tried different scenarios in this shelter to generate income and different ways of looking at cost? Could we come up with a way to not decrease the number of lives saved, but to still have a sustainable financial shelter? And so I'm going to highlight here with some circles. These are the three scenarios that we ended up looking at where we had a positive profit generated. And so we'll go from left to right. If you look at the one that's labeled I fee D10, that's an increase in our adoption fees. And the problem is that that results in a decrease of the total animals that got adopted. So because we raised our fees, we made the assumption that we would then lose some customers in terms of people who are willing to pay those fees, resulting in a total decrease in the number of lives saved. So perhaps that's not going to fit within the mission or vision of the average shelter, where yes, we did raise our fees and we were in the end able to generate a profit, but we decreased the number of lives saved. So that might not be in fitting with your vision for your own shelter. If you look at IFEE-D10, that's doing some of that sensitivity analysis that we talked about. Now, what if I raised those fees, but I didn't just decrease the numbers by 10% in terms of lives saved? What if a lot less people would pay the higher fees, and I decreased the total numbers by 20%? Well, my shelter financial situation actually got better off at the end of the day because I had less total animal cost. But again, is this really in keeping with your shelter's mission if I've now decreased the number of lives saved? you're better off financially, but was that really the goal? For most people, the answer is going to be no, that was not the goal to make a profit. The goal was to save lives. So that led us to ask, remember when we talked about decoupling or detaching revenues from the number of lives saved? What if we think about returns to promotions? And so if you skip over, we have 3 different return levels. So now if we actually move in from the right, you can see I have LPR return, that's a low return, and next to that is a fair return, and then a high return. And high return has that circle around it. And that's basically saying we have a high return from this additional investment in fundraising spending. And so we looked at some different levels in terms of for every dollar invested, did I generate $4, did I generate $6, or did I generate $8 in terms of total donations? And so this really rose to the top in terms of a way to not change the adoption fees from the baseline case, so therefore did not have to decrease the number of animal lives saved, but we were still able to pay for all of those costs and to actually generate a modest income for the modest profit for the shelter, which could then be used and reinvested. And so this really rose to the top in terms of a way to think about sort of pulling this all together. If we have an enterprise budget, we know what it costs to save a dog, a cat, a kitten, or a puppy, and we have an idea of what that gap is in terms of how much additional revenue we need for every life that comes through the shelter, we can really build that into our planning. We can think about our cash flow. We can think about our cash planning for the year. We can really set some hard targets in terms of if we're going to save this many lives and we're going to do it in a financially sustainable way, what is the exact number of donations that we need to attain? And that really becomes a powerful message that you can convey to people who you're talking to about fundraising or donations or promotions. You can really start to say, with this donation, we can save this many lives and we can do it in a financially sustainable way, so this shelter will be here next year to continue to serve the community. And so really at the end of this project, our point was to really highlight what are some ways we can think about creating a financially sustainable entity in terms of the shelter, where we have planned it out and we've really thought about where revenue needs to come from. Is it from adoptions? Is it from donations? How do we move some of these things around so we can save the most number of lives but do it in a sustainable way? And so in summary, the key tools that we really talked about and we used to sort of work through some of these analyses are thinking about enterprise budgeting, how valuable they are to have on hand so we can support our in-shelter decision making. Partial budgeting, where we're looking at just those changes. So think about how to really look at a simplified example and really kind of dive down and be able to make some quick decisions in terms of whether this is going to be a good change or a bad change for the shelter in terms of finances. And then thinking about the 3 key financial statements, so balance sheet, income statement, and cash flow statement. And ultimately, thinking about decision-making, incorporating both short-term and long-term goals and financial feasibility into the shelter. We learned that variable versus fixed costs are really key in terms of shelter management. Thinking about what drives up your total animal cost, and if we're going to keep increasing that total animal cost to save more lives or to work with animals who may have additional challenges that will cost more, to save, we really need to think about where the revenues are going to come to pay for that. We do in economics often talk about a shutdown rule, and I think it fits here in terms of thinking about variable costs, because shutdown rules are based on variable costs. We think about the fact that a firm should really shut down or stop performing service when its revenue received from what it provides can't cover those variable costs. So those variable costs are really, really important. And separating those out from the cost of having the building or the items that we have to pay for anyway, think about really separating those out and thinking about the costs that come with the actual animals and how are we going to pay for those variable costs, because when we think about really how the shelter is going to move forward, if we can't cover the variable costs of operation, it becomes very, very difficult to have a sustainable entity moving forward. And generally, that's when we would start to think economically about whether we should be operating. Because at that point, every additional life saved is actually moving the shelter backwards in a financial standing point. And so we really need to have a plan to combat that if we want to be sustainable and be able to move forward. We really need to know the costs and revenue associated with each enterprise so that we can make some sound decisions and ensure that we're here to perform our service and to move our missions forward for tomorrow.
Oh, and thank you, Dr. Widmar. We have time for questions now. So we're going to get this first question up. How do you calculate the value of volunteer time or goods donated?
Okay, this is a great question. This one goes back to our opportunity costs, where we started to think about how much do these sort of non-cash items cost in the shelter. And so it does become difficult because we said the opportunity cost is what else we could have done with that time, right? And that's really hard because you have different volunteers who would have honestly done very different things with their time likely. When we're thinking about shelter performance, we really just want to make sure that we're putting some sort of a reasonable, believable value on that time. And so oftentimes people put in simply an average. So do we want to say that every hour that someone donated in terms of caring for the animals in the shelter would be worth, for example, it's $10 an hour worth of time, because that's our best guess at what we would have had to pay to go out and hire someone to do it. It's also a good opportunity for some sensitivity to be performed. So you may want to think about calculating the cost to your shelter and say, what if I had to pay $7 an hour, $8 an hour? What if I had to pay $15 an hour for all the volunteer hours that went into my shelter? What would it look like at that point? So what would be the value or what would be the cost for each animal if it cost me $15 an hour? I think 15 is probably not the likely number I would use. I'd probably be circling somewhere around $10 an hour to put some bit of a fair value in terms of that time. But it is a good item to think about in terms of what it actually takes in resources to get the shelter to move forward. It'll be a similar answer for goods donated. You're going to want to try to put the value of that good if you were to sell it. That would be the technical answer. So what would that good be worth there in the market? In reality, we wouldn't look towards selling a lot of these donated goods. So I would look towards putting a price on that in terms of what it would have cost you to buy it. So if someone's going to donate an item that's worth, say, $10 in terms of what you would have paid for it, I would make sure that I at least had my $10 in there for the resource, the value of that resource that went into your shelter.
Okay, thank you. Let's get the next question up. Do you know of a resource that aggregates average base unit budgets, i.e. per cat, per dog, per kitten, per puppy, per feline leukemia positive kitten?
Do I know of a resource that exists? I suppose I have not seen an explicit enterprise budget that I would say would fit across the board. I've seen some out there, and I would have to honestly go back and look in terms of where to send you to look at the per cat, per dog, per puppy, per kitten. I can comment that this is something that we're working on right now in terms of pulling together a tool that would make it very simple to look at your own costs and to look through these different enterprises. So we are in the middle of working through finishing up a tool that would help you work through per cat, per dog, per puppy, per kitten for your own shelter. It will not exactly be able to calculate, for example, different conditions or different changes in expenses, but if you knew the approximate change or the different costs of caring for a FELV kitten, for example, it would make it very simple to do that. And so I don't have a resource for you that exists right now, although I can tell you that we're working very hard to get that available and to get that put up for you to make it simpler to run through your own numbers. I can comment that in many cases we do see across different industries published enterprise budgets, and I think they're a little bit of a double-edged sword. It's definitely a good resource to start with, but we really need to make sure that we adapt it for our own operation. And so even with the one that we put up, we're going to make sure there's lots of disclaimers that you're going to want to make sure that those fit your own shelter numbers, and don't just take my or anyone else's word for it that that's what it costs per dog.
Thank you. The next question: is it worthwhile to participate in shelter off-site events, even if not a lot of donations, sales of merchandise is generated? Is the exposure worth time?
This is a great question. Multiple things at work in this question. And so, is it worthwhile to participate in off-site events? The unfortunate but true answer is that it depends on the specific event, and it depends a lot on the cost of being there. And so this is a good case of where it really matters to calculate your cash cost versus your opportunity cost. If it costs you a lot in terms of actual cash expense, so if it's a case where we have to pay a fee, or we're paying for a booth, or we're really paying to be there, then I think we really need to think hard about, are we at least recovering the cash that we spent to be there? Where it gets a little bit more difficult, and where I'm guessing the question's coming from, is more in terms of, this is a ton of work. If we're going to have an off-site event, it's a ton of work, it's a lot of time. We all only have we have so much management capacity per day, and that's it, honestly. There's only 24 hours in a day. So should we be investing that kind of time? I can say that over time, you would want to be tracking future donations. So is the exposure worth the time is really going to be a question of, does that exposure eventually pay you back? And unfortunately, we can't answer that for it's going to be different for every shelter. I would hypothesize that in some situations, the exposure is indeed worth the time. So is it that somebody saw the name? Is it that maybe you didn't get a lot of donations or sale of merchandise right there, but I guess I don't know the specifics of the shelter, but did we make Facebook friends? Did we get the word out there? Did somebody go home and say, you know, I really saw this shelter out there and they're really doing good things? Even if they're not ever going to have an animal of their own, was there some positive word of mouth? We really need to start thinking about ways to track that. And so whether it's you explicitly ask people, you know, are we friending people on Facebook so we kind of get the connection out there? Are we handing out cards? Are we making sure that there's an opportunity for kids to see animals? Are we trying to measure the impact that we're having? I think a lot of times people get very passionate about what they're doing. They want to share their message, but they don't actually have in place the assessment or tools to actually measure whether that's working. So things to think about: when people then do donate, can you ask them how they heard about you? If people start telling you it was these various events, then at least you have some measure of whether they were worthwhile. Because the question is that you're saying you're not getting a lot of donations, is that day, or is that it's not helping your donations over time? I'm a little bit cautious in answering this question in particular, because if you're already doing off-site events, that's your baseline. And so I would hate to tell you that it's not worth the time and have you pull back and actually move backwards, because it could be that they're worth more than you think they are in terms of exposure. If you're not already doing them, then it's a very easy measurement in terms of start doing them and start measuring the impact. If you're already doing them, it's going to be a little more difficult, but I would still say we want to start to put together some budgets and think about how much time, how much expense, what are we generating. I apologize for the very long-winded.
That's fine. Thank you. As a follow-up to the previous question, Dr. Widmar, where can people go to find the information on your final findings for your research?
So final findings, we will be working with Maddie's, and so I don't know if, Lynn, maybe you can comment a little bit more in terms of where we might get that posted. We're also going to have it available through the Purdue website. And so you will be able to, I'm sorry?
You'll be able to find them at Purdue, the Purdue website, and we will also, at Maddie's Institute, have it on our website.
Yes. Yep,
okay.
So you should be able to get the link in both places.
Great. So here is the next question. When allocation costs for paid employees vary, if a manager does some of the services that a subordinate would normally do, does the cost analysis reflect the higher costs?
Okay, so if we're looking at allocating costs for employees, If we have our manager's salary included in our budgets as overhead or as a fixed cost, so that cost would not change with the number of animals, then we would expect that that cost is actually already being paid by all of the animals going through. So remember we said we have the variable costs, and that's costs that change with the number of animals, and then we have the fixed costs. Oftentimes those paid employees are going to fall in the fixed costs. And so we're going to say it costs us this amount to have the employees here, and it doesn't really matter the number of animals that are in this room. And so in that case, your costs for those employees would already have been spread across all the animals that are there, and we wouldn't want to double count them. And in that way, we're already accounting for the variation in cost. So if we have a manager who costs, I don't know, double what another employee costs, both of their salaries would already be being paid by every animal.
Very good. We have time for one more question, so we'll get that up for the audience to see. Is goodwill in the community considered an asset that should be valued on the balance sheet?
So goodwill is extremely difficult to value in terms of putting in our balance sheet. We do see public corporations, so there is oftentimes a category for goodwill that counts, especially if it's in the time of sale, that it usually really matters. So if you're buying a name that already exists and it's already recognized, then there's a value that goes with that name, and so that's usually where this sort of question arises. For the point of a shelter, even in corporate situations, that's usually valued at the time of a sale. And it's, as far as having it on the balance sheet for a shelter, it's not an asset that we can generally sell. So we generally can't generate real dollars from it and use it to pay our liabilities. So we need to be extremely careful about including that as an actual hard asset that we could measure against our debts to come up with a net worth. Certainly goodwill has value, but I'm going to be very, very cautious in terms of, do I really want to think about including it on the balance sheet as a hard number when it's very difficult to value? Again, we usually learn what those values are in a time of sale when we're selling a brand or selling an existing name. And so for the point of a shelter, it's going to be really hard to put that out there. Where it would have very large value is thinking about quantifying some of what you provide to the community and capitalizing on that goodwill through promotions and donations and other factors like that. So while it's not exactly something that we can look at the market for this particular shelter name and get a real hard dollar value on it, and we certainly can't use goodwill to pay our bills, so we can't use goodwill to pay down our debts. So I wouldn't include it in that facet, but I would certainly be capitalizing on that if I have a shelter that's very well known in the community, has a good name that people recognize. I would make sure that I'm capitalizing on that goodwill through promotions, donations, and certainly protecting that name and making sure that we're being very careful that we maintain what we've built up. And so goodwill is usually very hard to earn and very easy to lose. And so that's potentially just a word of caution on a related topic. It has value, but we need to make sure that we're using it appropriately. And as far as including it as a hard asset, we can't use it to pay down debt. It's not quite in the same category as a building or as inventories, and so I'm cautious there.
Okay, thank you very much. That's the end of our event tonight. We want to thank Dr. Widmar and all of you for your time tonight. Please click on the link to take our survey. It might have been blocked by your pop-up blocker, or it may be on a different screen. But don't worry, if you can't see it, we'll be sending the link to you. And we would really appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to respond. Join Maddie's Institute and nationally recognized trainer Amy Sadler on September 19th for an action-packed webcast, Playing for Life, Increasing the Quality of Life for Shelter Dogs with Play Groups. Watch your inbox. We'll be sending an announcement out next week. The archived version of tonight's webcast will be available soon. Please visit our website and sign up for our newsletter and our blog, and show your support by liking us on Facebook. Thanks again for sharing your evening with us. Good night.